Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're talking about Mongolia, and I need you to understand something right up front. This place is absurd. We're talking about a country the size of Alaska that has fewer people than Los Angeles. A country where the capital city is colder than anywhere in Siberia, where summer can hit 40 degrees Celsius and winter can drop to -50, and where roughly a third of the population still lives in tents and moves their entire lives several times a year following grass. This is a place that produced the largest contiguous land empire in human history, then spent the next 700 years being quietly sandwiched between Russia and China like the world's most awkward geopolitical middle child. So if you're settling in for the night, dim the lights, get comfortable, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from. And if you're new here, subscribe. We've got about 200 countries to get through, and Mongolia's a hell of a place to start. Let's go. Chapter 1. The Bones of the Earth. Picture yourself standing in the dead center of Mongolia on a clear afternoon in July. You turn in a slow circle, 360 degrees, and you see exactly the same thing in every direction. Grass. Not fields of grass, not farmland, not pasture in the sense you're probably imagining. Just grass, rolling away toward the horizon in gentle waves like a frozen ocean, stretching so far that the curve of the earth becomes visible before you spot a single tree or building. The sky is enormous, not big. Enormous, taking up maybe 3/4 of your field of vision, because the land is so flat and featureless that there's nothing to interrupt the view. It's the kind of emptiness that makes you feel simultaneously insignificant and weirdly free. This is the Mongolian steppe, and it covers roughly 80% of a country that's about 1.56 million square kilometers. For context, that's 3 times the size of France, or if you're American, roughly equivalent to Alaska and Texas combined. But here's the thing. Only 3.3 million people live here. You could fit the entire population of Mongolia into Los Angeles with room to spare. We're talking about 2 people per square kilometer, which makes this the most sparsely populated sovereign nation on Earth. You can drive for 6 hours in any direction and see maybe 3 buildings, 2 of which will be abandoned. Now, before you start thinking this is just one big empty grassland, let me complicate things. Mongolia is essentially divided into 4 major geographic zones, each of which seems designed to kill you in a different way. You've got the central steppe we just talked about, vast, grassy, deceptively peaceful. Then in the north you've got mountain forests that look like something out of Siberia, because functionally they are something out of Siberia. Dense pine forests, permafrost, rivers that run cold and fast, and enough mosquitoes in summer to blot out the sun. Head west and you hit the Altai Mountains, a genuinely impressive range where peaks climb above 4,000 meters and snow leopards still roam around like they own the place, which they basically do. The highest point in Mongolia is Khitan Peak at 4,374 meters, located right where Mongolia, China, Russia, and Kazakhstan almost touch. It's the kind of place where borders get weird because nobody wanted to climb up there to argue about it. And then because apparently 3 hostile environments weren't enough, you've got the Gobi Desert sprawling across the entire southern third of the country. Let's talk about the Gobi for a second, because it's not what you're picturing. When most people hear desert, they imagine sand dunes and Lawrence of Arabia. The Gobi is not that. The Gobi is a cold desert, which is exactly as miserable as it sounds. Most of it isn't sand, it's bare rock, gravel, and hard-packed earth that looks like the surface of Mars had a bad day. In winter, temperatures drop to -40 Celsius. In summer, they can hit +40. That's an 80-degree swing, which is genuinely insane. You can freeze to death in January and get heat stroke in July in the exact same spot. And because this is a desert with virtually no moisture in the air, the temperature can swing 30 degrees between noon and midnight on the same day. Pack accordingly, is what I'm saying. The Gobi is also home to some bizarre wildlife, including the Gobi bear, which holds the distinction of being the world's only desert-dwelling bear species. There are maybe 40 of them left. They survive by being small, nocturnal, and probably very confused about their life choices. The climate here is what's known as extreme continental, which is a polite way of saying completely unhinged, because Mongolia is landlocked smack in the middle of the largest landmass on Earth. Surrounded by Russia to the north and China on every other side, there's no ocean anywhere nearby to moderate the temperature. Oceans are like thermostats for the planet. They keep coastal areas from getting too hot or too cold. Mongolia doesn't have that. Mongolia has the opposite of that. It has thousands of kilometers of land in every direction, which means summer heat builds and builds with nothing to stop it, and winter cold does the same thing. Ulaanbaatar, the capital, is the coldest capital city in the world. Not Reykjavik, not Ottawa, Ulaanbaatar. Winter temperatures average -20 to -30 Celsius for months on end, and it's not uncommon for the city to hit -40. Meanwhile, summer can absolutely roast you. The Mongolians have a saying that translates roughly to 90 days of summer heat, 90 days of winter cold, and 80 days of figuring out what season it is. They're not exaggerating. But here's the part that genuinely messes with people's heads. Despite being one of the coldest countries on Earth, Mongolia gets over 260 sunny days per year. It's relentlessly, aggressively sunny. The sky is this deep, crystalline blue maybe 300 days a year, because there's almost no humidity and very little pollution outside the cities. It's the kind of sunshine that makes you squint even when it's -30 outside. The winters are brutal, but they're also weirdly beautiful in a way that makes you understand why people have lived here for thousands of years despite the weather actively trying to murder them. Snow falls dry and powdery. The air is so clear you can see mountain ranges 100 kilometers away, and at night the stars look close enough to touch. It's the kind of place that makes you feel very small and very alive at the same time, assuming you don't freeze to death. Water is scarce but crucial. Mongolia has over 4,000 lakes, but most are small, seasonal, and salty. The big exception is Lake Kuvsgol up in the north, which locals call the Blue Pearl of Mongolia. It's the second most voluminous freshwater lake in Asia and contains roughly 2% of the world's fresh water, which is a staggering amount for one lake. It's also pristine to the point of being drinkable straight from the source, assuming you're okay with it being absolutely freezing even in summer. The lake is over 130 meters deep in places and stays frozen for about half the year. In winter, the ice gets thick enough that people drive trucks across it, which seems insane until you remember that this is Mongolia and insane is kind of the baseline. Rivers are scattered and seasonal, but the Orkhon River, the longest in Mongolia at 1,124 kilometers, has been the lifeline for every major settlement in the region's history. If you're trying to build a civilization in Mongolia, you build it near the Orkhon. That's just how it works. The vegetation situation is about what you'd expect from a place that's either frozen or baking at any given moment. Roughly 80% of the country is grassland steppe, which is useful for grazing livestock, but not much else. About 1% is arable farmland. The north has forests, mostly larch and pine, covering maybe 10% of the country. The Gobi has almost nothing, just scrub brush and the occasional saxaul tree that looks like it's barely holding on. The lack of trees everywhere else is striking. You can travel for days and not see a single tree, just grass and sky and the occasional rocky outcrop. It makes the landscape feel exposed in a way that's hard to describe. There's nowhere to hide, no shade, no windbreak. Just you and the elements in a staring contest you're going to lose. And then there's the Zud. The Zud is a uniquely Mongolian disaster, a winter event so catastrophic it has its own name. It happens when a combination of drought, heavy snowfall, and extreme cold makes it impossible for livestock to reach the grass beneath the snow. Animals starve and freeze by the millions. A bad Zud can wipe out 30 to 40% of the country's livestock in a single season, which for a nation where a third of the population still practices nomadic herding is an absolute catastrophe. It's not a rare event. Either Zuds happen every few years. The winter of 2009 to 2010 killed over 8 million animals. That's not a historical footnote. That's a regular feature of life here. The land gives and the land takes away, and sometimes it takes away everything. Natural resources are another story entirely. Mongolia is sitting on absolutely massive deposits of copper, gold, coal, uranium, and rare earth minerals. The Oyu Tolgoi copper mine in the South Gobi is one of the largest copper deposits in the world. There's enough coal here to power half of Asia. The problem is that for most of human history, none of this mattered. Nomadic herders don't need copper mines. They need grass and water and animals that can survive the winter. So all of this mineral wealth just sat there, underground, irrelevant, while empires rose and fell on the surface. It's only in the last few decades that Mongolia has started to tap into these resources, and the results have been mixed. The mining industry brings in money, but also corruption, environmental damage, and a weird tension between traditional herding lifestyles and modern industrial capitalism. More on that later. The wildlife here is exactly what you'd expect from a place this harsh, sparse, tough, and weird. You've got snow leopards in the mountains, which are notoriously hard to spot but absolutely there. Gobi bears, as mentioned, clinging to existence in the desert. Wild Bactrian camels with 2 humps, perfectly adapted to go weeks without water. And then there's the taki, the Przewalski's horse, which is the only truly wild horse species left on Earth. They went extinct in the wild in the 1960s, survived only in zoos, and were reintroduced to Mongolia in the 1990s. There are a few hundred of them now, roaming the steppe like they have been for thousands of years. It's one of the rare conservation success stories, and it happened here because Mongolia has something most places don't. Space. Enormous, empty, uninterrupted space. Which brings us back to that fundamental weirdness of Mongolia. This is a country roughly the size of Western Europe with the population of a mid-sized American city. You can stand in the middle of the steppe and turn in a full circle and see nothing, no people, no buildings, no roads, no power lines. Nothing, and that view hasn't changed substantially in 1,000 years. About 75% of the land is still used for nomadic pastoralism, which is a fancy way of saying people still live in portable felt tents called jurs, raise sheep and goats and horses, and move their entire household several times a year to follow the grass. This isn't a historical reenactment. This isn't a tourist attraction. This is just life. In 2026, roughly 1 in 3 Mongolians still lives this way. The landscape is unforgiving, the climate is genuinely hostile, and the emptiness is so profound it can feel almost oppressive. But here's the thing. People have not only survived here, they've thrived. They've built empires. They've conquered half the known world. They've developed one of the most sophisticated nomadic cultures in human history, perfectly adapted to a land that seems designed to be uninhabitable. The steppe isn't empty because it's barren. It's empty because it takes an enormous amount of space to support a nomadic lifestyle in a place this harsh. Every family needs thousands of hectares of grazing land. Every herd needs room to move. And so the population stays low, the land stays open, and the rhythm of life continues the way it has for millennia. So that's the stage. Grass and sky and cold and heat and emptiness and beauty all tangled together in a place that makes absolutely no sense until you've stood in the middle of it and felt the wind come howling across 500 kilometers of uninterrupted steppe. This is where the story begins. This is the land that shaped the people, and the people who shaped the world. Chapter 2. Ghosts on Horseback. So we've established that Mongolia is essentially a giant, freezing, beautiful nightmare of a landscape. The obvious question is, who looked at this place and thought, yeah, I could live here? The answer apparently is humans, and they've been doing it for an absurdly long time. Archaeological evidence suggests people were wandering around the Mongolian steppe at least 800,000 years ago, which is well before anyone had figured out agriculture or written language or literally any technology that would make living here less miserable. These were Paleolithic hunter-gatherers chasing mammoths across the grasslands with stone-tipped spears, and they somehow survived winters that would kill a modern human with a North Face jacket and a smartphone. Respect. Fast forward to the Bronze Age, somewhere between 1200 and 300 BCE, and you start seeing evidence of actual cultures taking shape. The people living here during this period left behind two things that still dot the Mongolian landscape today: deer stones and kirigsurs. Deer stones are these carved standing stones, usually about 2 to 4 meters tall, covered in stylized images of deer, weapons, and belts. They're genuinely beautiful in a minimalist sort of way, and nobody's entirely sure what they were for. Probably ritual markers, possibly territorial boundaries, maybe just Bronze Age art projects. The kirigsurs are burial mounds. Massive stone structures that required serious communal effort to build, which suggests these weren't just scattered family groups anymore. This was organized society. People were claiming territory, burying their dead with ceremony, and leaving marks on the land that would last millennia. They also had horses by this point, which is important because horses are about to become the entire Mongolian identity. Now we need to talk about the Xiongnu, because they're the first group in this region to show up in historical records and immediately make everyone else's life difficult. The Xiongnu Empire emerged around 209 BCE under a guy named Bogd Khanate who unified a bunch of nomadic tribes into a genuinely terrifying military confederation. These were expert horsemen, phenomenal archers, and they had perfected a style of warfare that would define steppe combat for the next 2,000 years. Mounted archery, lightning-fast raids, and the tactical retreat that wasn't actually a retreat, but a trap to pull enemies into an ambush. The Chinese called them barbarians, which in ancient Chinese diplomatic language basically meant people we can't beat in a straight fight. The Xiongnu controlled a massive territory stretching from Manchuria to Central Asia, and they spent about 3 centuries making life absolutely miserable for the Han Dynasty to the south. Here's how bad it got. The Chinese built the Great Wall primarily to keep the Xiongnu out, not primarily to look impressive for tourists, not primarily as a symbol of national unity, primarily to stop Xiongnu raiders from showing up every autumn to steal grain, livestock, and people. The wall didn't really work. The Xiongnu just went around it or bribed the guards or waited for a section to fall into disrepair. But the fact that the Chinese spent centuries and untold resources building it tells you everything you need to know about how serious the threat was. The Xiongnu weren't just raiders. They were an existential problem. Modu Chanyu himself was apparently a piece of work. According to Chinese sources, which admittedly were not writing fan fiction about the guy, he seized power by killing his own father and then consolidated control by inventing a loyalty test that's genuinely insane. He trained his soldiers using a special whistling arrow, and the rule was simple. Wherever the whistling arrow landed, everyone had to shoot. First, he shot his favourite horse. Anyone who hesitated, he executed. Then he shot his favourite wife. Same deal. Then he shot his father's favourite horse, and when some of his father's guards hesitated, he killed them too. Then he shot his actual father, and apparently by that point everyone was so terrified they just went along with it. Which is one way to ensure unit cohesion, I guess. Modu ruled for about 35 years and turned the Xiongnu into the dominant power in Inner Asia, which is impressive even if his management style was, let's say, problematic. The Xiongnu Confederation wasn't a centralized empire in the way we usually think about empires. It was more like a military alliance held together by a combination of charismatic leadership, fear, and the understanding that raiding sedentary civilizations was more profitable than fighting each other. The Chanyu was the supreme leader, but below him were layers of tribal chiefs, each controlling their own people and territory. It worked as long as there was a strong Chanyu and an external enemy to focus on. When either of those things disappeared, the whole system tended to collapse, which is exactly what happened. Around 48 CE, the Xiongnu split into northern and southern factions over a succession dispute, spent the next few decades fighting each other, and eventually got crushed by a combination of Han Chinese military campaigns and a new group of steppe nomads called the Xianbei, who had been waiting in the wings for their moment. By 93 CE, the Xiongnu Empire was effectively finished. They lasted about 300 years, which for a nomadic confederation is honestly a pretty good run. The Xianbei moved in and dominated the Mongolian plateau for the next century or so, but they don't leave nearly as much historical footprint. They were militarily competent, they controlled the trade routes, they occasionally raided China, but they never quite achieved the same level of, "Oh God, here they come again" panic that the Xiongnu managed. They eventually fragmented and got absorbed into other groups, which is the recurring theme of steppe history. Confederation rises, dominates for a while, fragments due to succession disputes or military defeat, gets replaced by the next group. Rinse and repeat for 2,000 years. After the Xianbei came the Rouran Khaganate, which controlled the Mongolian plateau from roughly 330 to 555 CE. The Rouran are historically significant for two reasons. First, they were the ones who popularized the title Khagan, meaning supreme ruler, which every subsequent steppe empire would adopt. Second, they got absolutely demolished by a group called the Gokturks, who exploded onto the scene in 552 and established one of the most important empires you've probably never heard of. The Gokturks, the name means celestial Turks, were the first people to use the ethnonym Turk, and they controlled a territory stretching from Manchuria to the Black Sea. This is the first true transcontinental steppe empire, connecting East Asia to Europe via the Silk Road, and it was massive. They also developed the Old Turkic script, one of the first writing systems used by steppe nomads, which is a big deal because most nomadic cultures relied on oral tradition. Gokturk inscriptions are still standing in Mongolia today, carved into stone monuments, and they're some of the earliest written records we have from the region. The Gokturk Khaganate eventually did what every steppe empire does. It split into eastern and western halves, fought civil wars, and collapsed. By 744, they'd been replaced by the Uyghur Khaganate, which was a bit different from previous steppe empires in that the Uyghurs actually built cities. permanent cities, with walls and buildings and everything. This was unusual. Steppe nomads generally didn't do cities, because cities are the opposite of nomadic. But the Uyghurs were heavily involved in Silk Road trade, and trade requires infrastructure. They also adopted Buddhism and Manichaeism, which was even more unusual for steppe nomads, who traditionally practiced shamanism and worshipped Tengri, the eternal blue sky. The Uyghur Khaganate lasted until 840, when a combination of internal strife and attacks by another group called the Kyrgyz brought the whole thing down. The Uyghurs fled south and west, eventually settling in what's now Xinjiang, and the Mongolian plateau went back to being a chaotic patchwork of competing tribes. Which brings us to the Khitan Liao dynasty, which controlled eastern Mongolia and northern China from 907 to 1125. The Khitans were semi-nomadic, which means they tried to have it both ways, maintain steppe military traditions while also adopting Chinese administrative systems. It worked for a while. They created their own script, built cities, collected taxes, and ran an actual bureaucracy, all while still fielding cavalry armies that could go toe-to-toe with anyone. The Khitans are also the source of the name Cathay, which medieval Europeans used for China. Marco Polo called it Cathay. The Khitan Liao dynasty was powerful enough that when Europeans heard about this rich empire to the east, they heard about it through the Khitans. Eventually the Liao got conquered by the Jurchen Jin dynasty, and by the early 1200s, the Mongolian plateau was back to being a fractured mess of competing tribes with no central authority. So let's talk about what life was actually like during this period, because it's important context for what comes next. The people living on the Mongolian steppe during the centuries before Genghis Khan were divided into dozens of tribes and clans, each with their own territory, their own leaders, and their own long-standing grudges against everyone else. You had the Mongols, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Kerites, the Tatars, and a bunch of smaller groups, all living in roughly the same area, all speaking related languages, and all basically in a constant state of low-level warfare. Raiding was a way of life. You raided your neighbours for livestock, for women, for prestige, and because your grandfather had raided their grandfather, and blood feuds lasted generations. There was no unified Mongolian identity. If you asked someone who they were, they'd tell you their clan name, not Mongolian. The economy was purely pastoral. You raised sheep, goats, horses, cattle, and camels. You moved your herds seasonally to find grass and water. You lived in gers, those circular felt tents that could be packed up and moved in a couple of hours. Everything you owned had to be portable. Furniture was minimal. Wealth was measured in animals, not land, because land wasn't something you could own, it was just space you passed through. Trade existed, but it was limited. The Silk Road skirted the edges of Mongolia, and some groups participated in it, but most people were focused on survival, not commerce. You traded with neighbouring tribes when you weren't raiding them, and sometimes you did both in the same season. Religion was shamanic. People worshipped Tengri, the sky god, along with a whole pantheon of nature spirits associated with mountains, rivers, and specific locations. Shamans acted as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, conducting rituals, healing the sick, and predicting the future. Ancestors were venerated, and the spirits of dead warriors were believed to watch over their descendants. There was no organized church, no priesthood, no written scripture. It was all oral tradition, passed down through stories and songs and rituals that had been performed the same way for centuries. Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity had filtered into some tribes through contact with neighbouring civilizations, but shamanism remained dominant. And there was no writing, not in Mongolian anyway. Some tribes used scripts borrowed from the Uyghurs or Khitans, but literacy was rare and mostly limited to people involved in trade or diplomacy. History was oral. Laws were oral. Everything important was memorized and recited, which meant the people who could remember things, the elders, the bards, the shamans, held enormous cultural power. This would change very soon, but in the early 1200s, Mongolian culture was still almost entirely pre-literate. So that's the situation on the Mongolian steppe around the year 1200. Dozens of tribes locked in endless cycles of raiding and revenge. No central authority, no cities, no infrastructure. Just grass and horses and blood feuds and a political situation so fragmented that the idea of these people conquering half the planet would have seemed absolutely insane to anyone watching. But that's the thing about steppe nomads. They don't look dangerous until suddenly they are. Give them a leader who can unify the tribes. Give them a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting outward. And they become the most terrifying military force on Earth. All the pieces were in place. The land had shaped the people. The people had perfected the skills. They just needed someone to aim them. And they were about to get him. Chapter 3. From Outcast to Khan. Right. So, Genghis Khan. We need to talk about this guy, and we need to do it carefully, because the history here is so soaked in legend and propaganda and frankly horrifying violence that it's hard to separate the man from the myth. But let's start with the basics. He was born around 1162 with the name Temujin, somewhere on the Mongolian steppe near the Onon River. His father Yesugei was a minor clan leader, respectable but not powerful. Temujin's early life was, by all accounts, absolutely miserable. When he was about 9 years old, his father was poisoned by members of the Tatar tribe during a feast, which was a common occupational hazard for steppe leaders. With Yesugei dead, Temujin's clan, the Bogd, decided they didn't owe loyalty to a widow and her kids, so they just abandoned them, left them on the steppe to starve. This is important context, because Temujin went from being the son of a clan leader to being a homeless orphan literally overnight, and that does things to a person. His childhood was brutal. His family survived by foraging, fishing, and hunting small animals. They were so poor that when Temujin's half-brother Bekta started hoarding food and acting like he was in charge, Temujin and his full brother Kasar shot him with arrows and killed him. Temujin was maybe 13 years old at the time. His mother was, understandably, furious, but the message was clear. Temujin was not someone you pushed around. At some point during his teenage years, he was captured by a rival clan and enslaved, forced to wear a wooden collar called a kango. He escaped by braining a guard with the kango and fleeing into the wilderness. By his early 20s, Temujin had survived abandonment, starvation, fratricide, and slavery, and he'd learned a very important lesson. The old tribal system was arbitrary and cruel, and if you wanted to survive, you needed power, not birthright, not tradition, actual, tangible, unchallengeable power. His first big break came through marriage. Around 1178, he married a woman named Berta, who came from a more powerful clan. This gave him connections and legitimacy. But almost immediately after the wedding, Berta was kidnapped by the Merkits, who were settling an old blood feud with Temujin's father. This is where things get interesting strategically, because Temujin didn't have the forces to rescue her himself. So he went to Togrul, the Khan of the Khanates, who had been his father's ally, and essentially said, "Help me get my wife back, and I'll owe you." Togrul agreed. Temujin also reached out to his childhood friend Jamukha, who commanded his own group of warriors. Together they raided the Merkit camp, rescued Berte and slaughtered a bunch of merkits in the process. Berta came back pregnant. She gave birth to a son named Jochi, and for the rest of Jochi's life, people would quietly wonder if he was Temujin's biological son or the product of her captivity. Temujin publicly claimed him, but the whispers never stopped, which would cause massive problems later during succession disputes. Through the 1190s, Temujin slowly built his power base. He absorbed smaller clans, made strategic alliances, and started implementing ideas that were genuinely revolutionary for steppe politics. First, he promoted people based on merit, not aristocratic birth. If you were loyal and competent, you got command. Didn't matter if you were from a powerful clan or a nobody. This was unheard of. Second, he demanded loyalty to him personally, not to your tribe or clan. You weren't a merkit or a Kerite anymore. You were a Mongol serving Genghis Khan. Third, he was absolutely merciless to anyone who betrayed him, and surprisingly generous to anyone who served him well. He built a system where defecting to his side was rewarded and fighting against him was punished with total annihilation. It worked. His break with Jamuka is one of the key turning points. They'd been blood brothers, close allies, but by the late 1190s they were rivals for dominance over the Mongol tribes. The traditional steppe aristocrats backed Jamuka because he represented the old system where clan bloodlines mattered. The commoners, the outcasts, the people from weak clans, they backed Temujin because he offered them a path to advancement. It became a civil war, and it was vicious. At one point, Jamuka boiled 70 of Temujin's men alive in cauldrons, which even by steppe warfare standards was excessive. Temujin won through a combination of superior strategy, better discipline, and the fact that he kept his promises while Jamuka alienated his own allies. By 1206, Temujin had defeated or absorbed every major rival on the Mongolian plateau. That year, a Kurultai, a grand assembly of all the Mongol tribes, was held near the Onon River. The tribal leaders gathered and formally proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, which roughly translates to universal ruler or oceanic ruler, depending on who you ask. He was maybe 44 years old. He'd gone from abandoned orphan to supreme leader of a unified Mongol nation in about 3 decades, and he'd done it by breaking every rule of traditional steppe politics. He immediately started reorganizing the entire society. He created a decimal military system units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 that replaced tribal structures. He established a written legal code called the Yasa, which codified everything from military discipline to theft to adultery. He declared religious tolerance, which was unusual and pragmatic. He didn't care what god you worshipped as long as you obeyed him, and he made it very clear that betrayal would be met with extinction, not defeat. Extinction. Now that he'd unified the steppe, he had a problem. He had about 100,000 highly trained, extremely bored warriors who were used to raiding and fighting, and if he didn't give them an external enemy, they'd start fighting each other again. So he looked south toward China, which was fractured into several dynasties at the time, and decided that was the solution. In 1211, he invaded the Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China. The Jin had a massive population, fortified cities, and a sophisticated military. Genghis had none of those things. What he had was mobility, discipline, and a willingness to do absolutely horrifying things to achieve his objectives. The Mongols didn't besiege cities in the traditional sense. They showed up, demanded surrender, and if the city refused, they massacred everyone inside as an example to the next city. It was psychological warfare on an industrial scale. The Jin War dragged on for decades, but the Mongols won basically every major engagement because they were faster, more coordinated, and more motivated. Chinese armies were large but slow and bureaucratic. Mongol armies could move 100 kilometers in a day, surround a city before the defenders even knew they were coming, and retreat before reinforcements arrived. They also learned siege warfare from Chinese and Persian engineers they captured, which solved their main weakness. By the 1220s, the Qing dynasty was collapsing, and Genghis turned his attention west. And this is where things get genuinely nightmarish. In 1219, Genghis sent a trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled Central Asia and parts of Persia. The governor of the border city of Otrar decided the caravan members were spies, executed them, and seized their goods. Genghis sent ambassadors demanding an apology and compensation. The Khwarezmian Shah had the ambassadors killed. This was a catastrophic mistake. Genghis assembled an army of maybe 150,000 men and rode west with the explicit goal of destroying the Khwarezmian Empire so thoroughly that it would serve as a lesson to every civilization on Earth about what happened when you disrespected Mongol envoys. The campaign that followed was one of the most destructive military operations in human history. The Mongols took city after city: Bukhara, Samarkand, Herat, Nishapur, Merv, and the pattern was always the same: demand surrender. If they refused, breach the walls, kill everyone, burn everything, and move to the next city. At Nishapur, after a Mongol general was killed during the siege, Genghis ordered the entire population slaughtered and the city levelled. Skulls were stacked in pyramids. At Merv, which was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, estimates suggest over 1 million people were killed. The Khwarezmian Shah fled, died of illness on an island in the Caspian Sea, and his empire ceased to exist. The death toll from the Mongol conquests during Genghis's lifetime is estimated at around 40 million people, which was roughly 11% of the entire global population at the time. For context, World War II killed about 3%. This was systematic depopulation on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. Genghis Khan died in 1227, possibly from injuries sustained falling off his horse, possibly from illness, possibly from other causes. The sources disagree. He was around 65 years old. He was buried in secret, somewhere in the Khenti Mountains near his birthplace, and the location of his tomb has never been found. According to legend, everyone involved in the burial was killed to preserve the secret, and a river was diverted over the site. To this day, despite modern technology and significant effort, nobody knows where Genghis Khan is buried. His empire, at the time of his death, stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea. He'd conquered more territory than Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon combined, and he'd done it in about 20 years. Before he died, Genghis had divided his empire among his 4 sons, but he designated his 3rd son, Ögedei, as his successor as Great Khan. This was a smart move. Joki, the eldest, was still tainted by questions about his parentage, and had died shortly before Genghis anyway. Chagatai, the 2nd son, was too hot-tempered and rigid. Tului, the youngest, was capable but too young and too much of a traditionalist. Ögedei was diplomatic, competent, and most importantly, acceptable to his brothers. He was elected Great Khan in 1229, and he immediately set about consolidating and expanding what his father had built. Ögedei finished the conquest of the Qing Dynasty by 1234, established the Mongol capital at Karakorum in central Mongolia, and then turned his attention to Europe. In 1237, he launched a massive invasion of Rus and Eastern Europe under the command of his nephew Batu and the brilliant general Subutai. The Mongols smashed through Russian principalities, crushed a combined Polish-German army at Legnica, and defeated the Hungarians at Mohi. They reached the outskirts of Vienna. Western Europe was in a panic. And then, in 1241, Ögedei died, possibly from alcoholism, and the Mongol armies withdrew to participate in the election of the next great Khan. Europe got incredibly lucky. If Ögedei had lived another 5 years, the Mongols might have conquered Germany, France, and Italy. Instead, they turned around and went home, and Western Europe never faced a serious Mongol invasion again. The succession got messy. Ögedei's widow ruled as regent for 5 years, manoeuvring to get her son on the throne. But eventually Mongke, a grandson of Genghis through Tolui's line, was elected Great Khan in 1251. Mongke was a reformer and a micromanager. He conducted a census of the entire empire, reorganized the tax system, purged corruption, and launched new campaigns into Song China and the Middle East. He died in 1259, possibly from dysentery, possibly from an arrow wound, and the empire fractured into civil war over succession. Kublai Khan, Mongke's younger brother, eventually won the struggle and became Great Khan in 1260. Kublai was different from his predecessors. He was more interested in administration than conquest, more cynicized, more willing to adopt Chinese customs and governance. He moved the capital from Karakoram to Beijing, completed the conquest of the Song dynasty by 1279, and declared himself Emperor of China, founding the Yuan dynasty. This was the peak. The Mongol Empire, at its greatest extent, controlled roughly 24 million square kilometers, making it the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. Roughly 1 in 6 people on Earth lived under Mongol rule. But here's the thing about empires that big. They don't stay unified. By the late 1300s, the Mongol Empire had effectively split into 4 separate khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia. They were technically still part of one empire, but in practice they operated independently and sometimes fought each other. The era of unified Mongol rule was over. What replaced it was something historians call the Pax Mongolica Mongol Peace. For about a century, the Mongol Khanates enforced relative stability across Eurasia. Trade flourished. The Silk Road was safer than it had been in centuries. Goods, ideas, and technologies moved freely between East and West. Paper, gunpowder, the compass, printing, all of these spread to Europe during this period, facilitated by Mongol rule. Of course, the Pax Mongolica also spread the Black Death. Turns out when you create a vast network of trade routes and enforce safe passage for merchants, you also create a highway for plague-carrying fleas. The pandemic that killed 1/3 of Europe's population in the 1300s started in Central Asia and spread west along Mongol trade routes. So, pros and cons. By the mid-1400s, the Khanates were in decline. The Yuan dynasty was overthrown by the Ming in 1368. The Golden Horde fragmented into smaller Khanates. The Ilkhanate collapsed into civil war. The Mongol Empire, as a political entity, was finished. But the impact was permanent. They'd redrawn the map of Asia. They'd connected East and West in ways that would shape global history for centuries. And they'd proven that a relatively small group of steppe nomads, if unified and directed by brilliant leadership, could conquer the world. Mongolia itself, though? Mongolia went back to being a collection of squabbling tribes. The center of the empire had moved to China, to Russia, to Persia. The Mongolian heartland became a backwater again, which is ironic considering it had just produced the largest empire on Earth. Chapter 4. After the Fall. So the Mongol Empire collapsed. The Yuan dynasty got kicked out of China by the Ming in 1368. and suddenly Mongolia had to figure out what it was supposed to be now that it wasn't the center of the world's largest empire. The answer, unfortunately, was a mess. The Mongols who'd been ruling China retreated north to the steppe and established what historians call the Northern Yuan dynasty, which sounds impressive until you realize it was basically a bunch of former imperial administrators trying to maintain legitimacy while controlling progressively less territory and fighting progressively more civil wars. The Northern Yuan lasted in name until 1635, but in practice it fragmented almost immediately into competing factions that spent more time fighting each other than doing anything productive. The main division was between the Eastern Mongols, called the Khalkha, and the Western Mongols, known as the Oirats. These weren't just geographic distinctions. They were political, cultural, and increasingly hostile. The Khalkha considered themselves the true heirs of Genghis Khan's legacy because they were descended from his line and controlled the traditional Mongol heartland. The Oirats didn't care about bloodlines and thought they should lead because they were militarily stronger and better organized. Both sides had legitimate arguments. Both sides also spent the next 2 centuries intermittently trying to kill each other, which meant that neither side could actually consolidate power or rebuild anything resembling the old empire. It was the political equivalent of 2 crabs in a bucket pulling each other down. There were occasional attempts at reunification. The most notable was by Ultan Khan in the 1500s, who managed to bring a bunch of Mongol tribes under his control and even raided Ming China a few times, just for old times' sake. But Ultan Khan's most lasting contribution wasn't military, it was religious. In 1578, he invited a Tibetan Buddhist Lama named Sonam Gyatso to Mongolia and gave him the title Dalai Lama, which means Ocean of Wisdom. This was the 3rd Dalai Lama, retroactively making the previous 2 Dalai Lamas, even though the title hadn't existed yet, which is confusing but very Buddhist. Ultan Khan's conversion to Tibetan Buddhism triggered a massive religious transformation across Mongolia. Within a few decades, Buddhism had replaced shamanism as the dominant religion. Monasteries were being built everywhere, and a significant percentage of the male population was becoming monks. Now, you might think this was a positive development, spirituality, education, culture, all that good stuff. And in some ways it was. Monasteries became centers of learning. Literacy increased. Art flourished. But there was a downside that would have massive consequences later. Monks take vows of celibacy. When a huge chunk of your male population stops reproducing, your population stops growing. Combine that with endemic warfare, periodic epidemics, and harsh living conditions, and Mongolia's population actually declined during this period. By the 1700s, there were fewer Mongols alive than there had been during the time of Genghis Khan, despite having had 4 centuries to grow. The warrior culture that had conquered half the planet was being systematically replaced by a monastic culture that emphasized pacifism and meditation, which is lovely from a spiritual perspective but strategically problematic when your neighbors are building armies. Speaking of neighbors, the Manchus. The Manchus were a semi-nomadic people from what's now northeastern China, and in the early 1600s they were in the process of conquering everything in sight. They'd established the Qing Dynasty in 1636 and were expanding rapidly. Mongolia, fractured and weakened, was an obvious target. The last ruler of the Northern Yuan, a guy named Bogd Khanate, tried to resist, but he was facing a 2-front war against both the Manchus and rival Mongol factions who'd decided that siding with the Qing was preferable to fighting for a losing cause. Bogd Khanate died in 1634, possibly from smallpox, and his son surrendered shortly after. The Manchus absorbed Inner Mongolia, the southern part, closer to China almost immediately. Outer Mongolia, the Khalkha territory, held out a bit longer, but by 1691 they'd also submitted to Qing authority, partly out of military necessity and partly because the Qing were offering protection against the Oirats, who were still causing problems. And so began roughly 220 years of Qing rule over Mongolia, which was a slow, quiet, humiliating decline. The Qing were clever about how they governed Mongolia. They didn't try to directly administer it the way they did with China proper. Instead, they used a system of indirect rule, working through existing Mongol nobility and Buddhist monasteries. The Mongol princes kept their titles and their local authority as long as they acknowledged Qing supremacy and paid tribute. Buddhist leaders were given state support and autonomy in exchange for preaching loyalty to the emperor. It was a soft occupation, but it was still an occupation. The Qing restricted trade, banned Mongols from owning firearms, and actively encouraged the growth of monasteries because a population of monks was easier to control than a population of warriors. They also divided Mongolia administratively into dozens of small territories to prevent any one leader from accumulating too much power. It was classic divide and rule strategy, and it worked perfectly. By the 1800s, Mongolia was economically stagnant, militarily irrelevant, and politically powerless. The population had stabilized at maybe 500,000 to 1 million people, spread across an area the size of Western Europe. Most people still lived as nomadic herders, moving their gers seasonally, raising livestock, and trying to survive winters that killed a significant percentage of their animals every few years. Poverty was endemic. The monasteries controlled huge amounts of wealth, but the common people had almost nothing. Chinese and Russian merchants controlled what little trade existed, often through exploitative credit systems that kept Mongols in permanent debt. There was no industry, no infrastructure, barely any towns, and almost no contact with the outside world. Mongolia had become a forgotten backwater, and most people outside of East Asia had no idea it still existed as a distinct culture. It was just that empty bit between Russia and China. And then, in 1911, the Qing Dynasty collapsed. The Xinhai Revolution in China overthrew the emperor and established the Republic of China, and suddenly Mongolia's overlords were gone. The Mongol nobility saw an opportunity. In December 1911, they declared independence and established the Bogd Khanate, a theocratic state led by the Jebtsundamba Hutuktu, who was essentially the Mongolian equivalent of the Dalai Lama. He took the title Bogd Khan Holy King and was believed by his followers to be a living Buddha, the reincarnation of a revered Lama. The guy was in his late 50s, partially blind, allegedly fond of alcohol and young men, and completely inexperienced in statecraft. But he was the spiritual leader of Mongolian Buddhism, so he got the job. It was independence, technically, but it was fragile and heavily dependent on Russian support. Russia, for its part, was thrilled. A nominally independent Mongolia meant a buffer state between Russian Siberia and China, which was strategically useful. The Russians provided military advisors, weapons, and diplomatic recognition. They also made sure Mongolia stayed in Russia's orbit and didn't get too friendly with China or any other power. It was independence with strings attached, but after 2 centuries of Qing rule, the Mongols weren't in a position to be picky. The problem was that China didn't recognize Mongolian independence. The new Republic of China considered Mongolia to be part of Chinese territory, just temporarily out of control, and they had every intention of reasserting authority when they got the chance. This led to the Treaty of Kyakhta in 1915, a compromise brokered between Russia, China, and Mongolia that satisfied absolutely nobody. Mongolia was granted autonomy, not independence. It could govern its internal affairs, but it remained under Chinese suzerainty, meaning China technically still had authority. The Mongols felt betrayed by the Russians, who'd pressured them to accept the deal. The Chinese felt insulted because they'd been forced to recognize Mongolian autonomy at all. The Russians were annoyed because they hadn't gotten as much control as they wanted. It was a masterclass in how to write a treaty that guarantees future conflict, is less than has own, is greater than. And sure enough, in 1919, a Chinese warlord named Xu Shuzheng marched into Mongolia with an army, occupied Urga, the capital, which would later be renamed Ulaanbaatar and formally ended Mongolian autonomy. The Bogd Khan was reduced to a figurehead with no power. Chinese troops were stationed throughout the country. It looked like Mongolia's brief experiment with independence was over before it had really begun. The Mongol nobility sent desperate appeals to Russia for help, but Russia was in the middle of its own civil war and couldn't do anything. Mongolia was occupied, humiliated, and seemingly out of options. But here's where things get absolutely wild. In 1921, a white Russian general named Baron Roman von Ungern Sternberg showed up, and I need you to understand that this man was completely certifiably insane. He was a Baltic German aristocrat who'd fought in World War I, joined the anti-Bolshevik white movement during the Russian Civil War, and fled east when the Reds started winning. Somewhere along the way, he'd become obsessed with Genghis Khan, convinced himself he was the reincarnation of one of Genghis's generals, and decided his destiny was to restore the Mongol Empire as a bulwark against communism. He led a ragtag army of white Russian cavalry, Mongol soldiers, Tibetan monks, and various other desperados into Mongolia, attacked the Chinese garrison at Urga, and somehow won. Ungern Sternberg briefly controlled Mongolia. He liberated the Bogd Khan, restored him to nominal power, and then proceeded to conduct a reign of terror that made the Chinese occupation look gentle by comparison. He executed people at random, conducted pogroms against Jews and communists, practiced divination using Tibetan Buddhist rituals, and declared himself a living god. He was planning to march west, reconquer Russia, and restore the Russian monarchy, which was ambitious considering he had maybe a few thousand troops and the Red Army had millions. His own men eventually decided he was too crazy to follow, and when the Red Army and Mongolian communists counterattacked later that year, his forces collapsed. Ungern was captured, put on trial in Siberia, and executed by firing squad. His reign in Mongolia lasted about 6 months, but it was 6 of the weirdest months in Mongolian history, which is saying something. The people who defeated Ungern were Mongolian revolutionaries backed by the Soviet Red Army, and this is where Mongolia's modern history really begins. The revolution of 1921 brought the communists to power, and Mongolia would remain under Soviet influence for the next 70 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point is that by the early 1900s, Mongolia had gone from empire to backwater to briefly independent to occupied to liberated by a lunatic to communist in the span of a decade. It was chaos, and the chaos was about to get worse before it got better. Looking back at this entire period from the fall of the Yuan dynasty to the 1920s, what's striking is how thoroughly Mongolia's fortunes had reversed. The descendants of the people who'd conquered the largest empire on earth were now subjects of other empires, pawns in great power politics between Russia and China, economically exploited, militarily weak, and culturally marginalized. The monasteries held spiritual authority, but that didn't translate to political power on the international stage. The old warrior ethos had faded, the population had shrunk, and yet, through all of this, the Mongols maintained their cultural identity. They still spoke Mongolian, they still lived as nomadic herders, they still revered Genghis Khan's memory, even if they couldn't match his achievements. The empire was gone, but the people endured. which is maybe the most important thing to understand about this period. Empires rise and fall, borders shift, governments change, but cultures, if they're resilient enough, survive. Mongolia survived the Ming, it survived the Qing, it survived occupation, exploitation, and centuries of being treated as a strategic afterthought. And it was about to survive communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the whiplash transition to capitalism. But all of that is still to come. Chapter 5. Red Dawn on the Steppe. Right, so in 1921 Mongolia became communist. This wasn't a spontaneous grassroots movement where Mongolian herders suddenly discovered Marx and decided to overthrow the feudal system. This was a revolution orchestrated, funded, and militarily supported by the Soviet Union, which was very interested in having a buffer state between itself and China. The Mongolian People's Party was founded in 1921 with Soviet backing, led by a small group of revolutionaries including a guy named Damdin Sukbatar, who became the military hero of the revolution. Sukbatar is still revered in Mongolia today. There's a giant square named after him in Ulaanbaatar. His face was on the money for decades, and every Mongolian kid learns about him in school. He died in 1923 at age 30, possibly from poisoning, possibly from illness, and the exact circumstances are still debated. But he'd already served his purpose. He was the charismatic face of the revolution, and his early death turned him into a martyr before he could become politically inconvenient. In 1924, the Bogd Khan died. Instead of finding another reincarnation and continuing the theocratic system, the Mongolian People's Party declared the Mongolian People's Republic, making Mongolia the second communist country in the world after the Soviet Union. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Soviets had been waiting for the Bogd Khan to die so they could formally abolish the monarchy without triggering a religious crisis. From this point forward, Mongolia was essentially a Soviet satellite state, not officially a Soviet republic, but functionally the 16th Republic of the USSR. Every major political decision was made in consultation with Moscow. Soviet advisors were everywhere. The economy was integrated with the Soviet system. Russian became the language of education and government. For the next 66 years, Mongolia's fate was tied to the Soviet Union's, for better and for worse. Let's start with the worse, because it was genuinely horrific. In the 1930s, under the leadership of Khorloogiin Choibalsan, who was essentially Mongolia's Stalin and operated under Stalin's direct orders, the Mongolian government conducted a series of purges that decimated the country's elite. The targets were Buddhist monks, intellectuals, aristocrats, and anyone suspected of nationalist or counter-revolutionary sympathies. Monks were particularly targeted because Buddhism was seen as feudal superstition that stood in the way of socialist progress. Over the course of the 1930s, roughly 17,000 monks were executed. About 700 monasteries were destroyed, their libraries burned, their artwork melted down or shipped to Soviet museums. By the end of the decade, Buddhism had been effectively eradicated from public life. A religion that had defined Mongolian culture for 4 centuries was nearly wiped out in less than 10 years. The total death toll from the purges is estimated at somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 people, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that Mongolia's total population at the time was only around 700,000. That's roughly 10% of the adult male population executed or sent to labor camps. The purges destroyed an entire generation of educated Mongols. The people who knew history, literature, traditional medicine, Buddhist philosophy, they were systematically murdered, and the knowledge they carried died with them. It was cultural genocide disguised as political reform, and it left scars that Mongolia is still dealing with today. But here's the complicated part. Alongside the terror, there was genuine modernization. The communist government built schools, hospitals, and roads. Literacy rates, which had been abysmal under the Qing and the Bogd Khanate, shot up. By the 1980s, Mongolia had near universal literacy. Healthcare improved dramatically. Life expectancy increased. Infant mortality dropped. Women got access to education and professional opportunities that had been completely unavailable under the old system. Ulaanbaatar grew from a town of maybe 30,000 people to a city of over 400,000. Industry was developed: factories, mines, power plants. The Soviet Union poured money and expertise into Mongolia, building infrastructure and training Mongolians in modern technical skills. For the average herder who'd spent centuries living in grinding poverty under exploitative nobles and merchants, the communist system brought tangible improvements to daily life. Of course, these improvements came with strings attached. Nomadic herders were forced into collective farms called negdals, where their livestock became state property and they worked for fixed wages instead of owning their own animals. The old pattern of moving freely across the steppe was restricted. You were assigned to a collective, and that's where you stayed. Some negdals were well run and provided decent living standards. Others were disasters. The efficiency of your local bureaucrat determined your quality of life, which is a pretty terrible system if you happen to get stuck with a bad bureaucrat. The negdal system also clashed fundamentally with Mongolian cultural values. Nomadic pastoralism isn't just an economic activity, it's an identity. Being told you can't own your own animals and can't move where you want is like being told you're not really Mongolian anymore. A lot of people adapted. A lot of people resented it deeply. In 1941, Mongolia switched from the traditional Mongolian script, which had been used since the 13th century, to the Cyrillic alphabet, the same alphabet used by Russian. This was framed as a modernization effort to increase literacy, but it was also a deliberate cultural break with the past. Suddenly, everything written in the old script was inaccessible to younger generations, unless they specifically learned it, which most didn't. Historical documents, religious texts, literature, all of it became effectively unreadable. It severed Mongolia's connection to its own written heritage, which was exactly the point. The Soviets wanted Mongolia looking forward towards socialism, not backward toward Genghis Khan and Buddhist traditions. One bright spot during this period was the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. Japanese forces, which had occupied Manchuria and were expanding westward, invaded eastern Mongolia. The Soviets, honouring their mutual defence treaty with Mongolia, sent in troops under General Georgy Zhukov. The resulting battle was a massive combined arms engagement involving tanks, aircraft, and artillery, modern industrial warfare on the Mongolian steppe. The Soviets and Mongolians crushed the Japanese forces, inflicting something like 60,000 casualties and forcing Japan to sign a ceasefire. This battle is significant for two reasons. First, it convinced Japan not to invade the Soviet Union during World War II, which meant the Soviets could focus their resources on fighting Germany. Second, it was a rare moment when Mongolia got to be on the winning side of a major military conflict, which did wonders for national morale after decades of being pushed around by larger powers. After World War II, Mongolia settled into a long period of Soviet-style stagnation. The economy was centrally planned, inefficient, and entirely dependent on Soviet subsidies. Industry existed but was minimal. The main economic activity was still herding, now organized through collectives. The political system was a one-party state with no dissent tolerated. The Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party controlled everything, and the party leadership followed whatever directives came from Moscow. There was stability in the sense that nothing much changed, but there was also no dynamism, no innovation, no freedom. You could get a decent education, a job, and health care, but you couldn't criticize the government, practice your religion openly, or leave the country without permission. It was the classic communist bargain: security and basic services in exchange for freedom. Culturally, this period was weird. The government was simultaneously trying to suppress traditional Mongolian culture and also claim Genghis Khan as a socialist hero. Buddhism was banned, but the state promoted Mongolian language and literature as long as it had the right ideological content. Traditional music and dance were encouraged in sanitized, approved forms. The Naadam Festival, Mongolia's traditional celebration involving wrestling, horse racing and archery, was preserved, but reframed as a celebration of the revolution rather than a cultural tradition. It was selective cultural preservation, where anything that supported the socialist narrative was fine and anything that didn't was erased. By the 1980s, cracks were appearing. The Soviet Union under Gorbachev was implementing perestroika and glasnost restructuring and openness. These reforms created ripple effects throughout the Soviet bloc. In Mongolia, a younger generation that had grown up with education and relative stability started asking uncomfortable questions. Why couldn't they travel freely? Why was there only one political party? Why couldn't they practice Buddhism if they wanted to? The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 was a watershed moment. If Eastern Europe could overthrow communism, why not Mongolia? In December 1989, a small group of young intellectuals organized the first pro-democracy protests in Ulaanbaatar's main square. At first, there were maybe a few hundred people, then a few thousand. By early 1990, tens of thousands were showing up. They were peaceful, organized, and persistent. They demanded multi-party elections, free speech, and economic reform. The government, watching what was happening in Romania where the communist leadership had been executed, decided that accommodation was preferable to martyrdom. The Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party agreed to political reforms. In July 1990, Mongolia held its first democratic elections. The MPRP actually won those first elections, partly because they were still the only party with nationwide organisation, and partly because a lot of rural voters didn't trust the new democratic parties yet. But the key thing is that the elections were genuinely competitive and relatively fair. The MPRP accepted the new rules. Opposition parties were allowed to form and campaign. Free speech was protected. The one-party state was over, and nobody got shot. This is worth emphasizing because Mongolia's transition to democracy was one of the most peaceful in the entire former communist world. No civil war, no violent crackdown, no bloodshed. The government just gave up power. Gradually, reluctantly, but they did it. In 1992, a new constitution was adopted. Mongolia became a parliamentary republic with a president, a prime minister, and a legislature elected through democratic elections. The economy was opened up to market reforms. State enterprises were privatized. Foreign investment was welcomed. Buddhist monasteries were allowed to reopen, and people could practice their religion freely again. The Cyrillic alphabet stayed. It was too entrenched to change back, but traditional Mongolian script started appearing on signs and monuments as a symbolic gesture. Genghis Khan, who'd been a taboo subject during the Soviet era because he represented nationalism and empire rather than international socialism, was suddenly everywhere again. Statues, currency, branding, tourism, he became the national symbol once more. The communist period, looked at from a distance, was a bizarre interlude in Mongolian history. For 7 decades, Mongolia was Soviet in everything but name. It industrialized, modernized, and urbanized faster than it ever would have under traditional systems. It also lost huge swaths of its cultural heritage, suffered brutal political repression, and became economically dependent on a foreign power. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Mongolia lost its biggest trading partner, its security guarantee, and its source of subsidies overnight. The economy tanked, unemployment spiked, the negdels collapsed, and suddenly people had to figure out how to survive in a market economy with no safety net. It was chaos again, just a different kind of chaos than 1921. But once again, Mongolia survived. The herders went back to traditional pastoralism, owning their own animals and moving freely again. The cities struggled but adapted. Democracy, despite being messy and contentious and sometimes corrupt, took root. The peaceful transition of 1990 is now seen as one of Mongolia's proudest modern achievements, proof that the country could change its entire political and economic system without violence. After centuries of being conquered, occupied, and pushed around by larger powers, Mongolia had finally chosen its own path. It was independence, real independence, for the first time since maybe the 1300s, and the question now was, what would they do with it? Chapter 6: Democracy, Dust, and Copper. So Mongolia entered the 1990s as a newly democratic, newly capitalist country with basically no experience running either a democracy or a market economy. The Soviet Union, which had subsidized Mongolia's entire economy for 7 decades, collapsed in 1991 and stopped sending money. The negdels, the collective farms, fell apart because they'd only existed through state support. Factories closed because they'd been built to serve Soviet needs, and suddenly there was no Soviet market to sell to. Unemployment spiked. GDP collapsed by roughly 30% over the course of the decade. People who'd had stable jobs and guaranteed housing under communism suddenly had neither. It was economic shock therapy, and the shock was severe. The government implemented rapid market reforms, privatization, price liberalization, all the standard International Monetary Fund prescriptions, and the results were mixed at best. Some people adapted quickly, started businesses, and made money. A small class of entrepreneurs and former communist officials who'd positioned themselves well became genuinely wealthy. But for most people, especially in rural areas, the transition was brutal. Herders who'd been part of collectives suddenly had to figure out how to survive on their own again. Many didn't have the capital to buy enough livestock to be economically viable. Poverty rates shot up. By the late 1990s, roughly a third of the population was living below the poverty line, which for a country that had just spent 7 decades promising equality and social security was a bitter irony. And then the Zuds came back. Remember the Zud, that uniquely Mongolian disaster where extreme winter conditions kill massive numbers of livestock? In the winter of 1999 to 2000, Mongolia experienced one of the worst Zuds in living memory. Temperatures dropped below -50 Celsius in some areas, snow buried the grasslands, and over 3 million animals died. For herders who'd just regained ownership of their livestock after the collapse of the collectives, this was catastrophic. Entire families lost everything. The government, which had no experience with disaster relief in a market economy and no Soviet Union to bail them out, struggled to respond. People starved. Migration to Ulaanbaatar accelerated as rural families fled to the capital looking for any kind of work. The city, which had been built for maybe 500,000 people during the Soviet era, suddenly had to absorb hundreds of thousands of climate refugees and economic migrants with no infrastructure to support them. But here's where Mongolia's luck started to turn. It turned out that all those mineral resources sitting underground for millennia were suddenly very valuable. China's economic boom in the 2000s created massive demand for copper, coal, and other raw materials, and Mongolia was sitting on some of the largest untapped deposits in Asia. The Oyu Tolgoi copper mine in the South Gobi is one of the world's largest copper deposits. The Tavan Tolgoi coalfield contains billions of tons of high-quality coking coal, gold, uranium, rare earth minerals. Mongolia had all of it. Foreign mining companies showed up with investment capital. The government negotiated contracts, and by the mid-2000s, mining had become the backbone of the Mongolian economy. Today, mining accounts for roughly a quarter of Mongolia's GDP and about 90% of its exports. That's an incredibly resource-dependent economy, which is both a blessing and a curse. When commodity prices are high and the mines are running, government revenues surge, infrastructure gets built, and everyone benefits. When prices drop or China's economy slows down, Mongolia's economy tanks. There's very little economic diversification. You've got mining, herding, and some tourism, and that's basically it. There's no major manufacturing sector, no tech industry, no significant agricultural exports. The country's economic fate is tied almost entirely to global commodity markets and China's appetite for raw materials, which makes for a volatile and somewhat precarious situation. The mining boom also created massive inequality. The people who own mining companies or work in mining-adjacent industries have gotten rich. Everyone else, not so much. Ulaanbaatar now has luxury car dealerships, high-end restaurants, and shopping malls that wouldn't look out of place in Seoul or Singapore. It also has sprawling ger districts on the outskirts where tens of thousands of families live in traditional felt tents with no running water, burning coal for heat, and dealing with unemployment and poverty. The city now contains roughly 50% of Mongolia's entire population, about 1.6 million out of 3.3 million, which is an insane concentration for a country this big. Everyone's moving to the capital because that's where the jobs are, but the city can't handle the influx. And this has created an environmental disaster. Ulaanbaatar is now regularly ranked as one of the most polluted cities on Earth, especially in winter. The problem is the ger districts. These are unplanned settlements where people live in traditional tents heated by burning coal and whatever else they can find. When you've got hundreds of thousands of households burning coal in sub-zero temperatures with no emissions controls, you get air pollution so bad it's legitimately dangerous to breathe. On the worst winter days, the air quality index hits levels that are classified as hazardous, and you can see the smog hanging over the city like a brown blanket. Kids develop respiratory problems. Hospitals fill up. The government knows it's a problem but hasn't figured out how to solve it without forcibly relocating people or subsidizing modern heating systems for hundreds of thousands of households, neither of which is politically or economically feasible. Beyond the cities, environmental challenges are mounting. Climate change is hitting Mongolia hard. Temperatures have risen about 2 degrees Celsius over the past 70 years, which is higher than the global average. Desertification is accelerating. The Gobi is expanding northward. Grasslands that used to support herds are turning into bare dirt. Overgrazing is part of the problem. There are simply too many animals on too little land, driven by the cashmere industry, which is hugely profitable but ecologically destructive. Cashmere goats eat grass down to the roots, preventing regrowth. The traditional nomadic system worked because herders moved frequently and allowed pastures to recover. Now, with better veterinary care and market incentives to maximize herd sizes, there are more animals than the land can sustainably support, and it's degrading the ecosystem. Mining also has environmental costs. Copper and gold mining require enormous amounts of water in a country that's already water scarce. Tailings, ponds leak. Dust from open-pit mines blows across the steppe. Local communities near mines complain about contaminated water and destroyed grazing land, but their complaints often get ignored because mining revenue is too economically important to slow down. It's the classic resource curse dilemma. You need the revenue from extraction, but extraction damages the environment and doesn't generate enough local employment to offset the harm. Most mining profits leave the country entirely, going to foreign investors or into the pockets of a small domestic elite. Politically, Mongolia has actually done reasonably well. Democracy is consolidated, elections happen regularly and are generally free and fair. Power has transferred peacefully between parties multiple times, which is more than a lot of post-communist countries can say. The Mongolian People's Party, formerly the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, they dropped revolutionary after the transition and the Democratic Party alternate in power. There's a free press, civil society organizations operate openly, and people can criticize the government without getting arrested. It's a genuine democracy, albeit one with serious corruption problems. Politicians routinely get accused of taking bribes from mining companies. Nepotism is rampant, and government procurement is riddled with kickbacks. But elections still matter, and voters can and do throw out governments they're unhappy with. Mongolia's foreign policy is dominated by what they call the third neighbour strategy. The country is geographically trapped between Russia and China, two enormous authoritarian powers that account for about 97% of Mongolia's trade. That's not a comfortable position. Mongolia doesn't want to become a client state of either, so they've cultivated relationships with third neighbours, countries that aren't geographically adjacent but can provide diplomatic and economic counterweight. The United States, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union all fall into this category. Mongolia contributes troops to UN peacekeeping missions, hosts joint military exercises with the US, and positions itself as a democratic success story in a region full of authoritarianism. It's a smart strategy for a small country trying to maintain independence, but there are limits to how much it can work when 97% of your trade goes through two neighbours who could economically strangle you if they wanted to. Culturally, there's been a revival of traditional practices that were suppressed during the Soviet era. Buddhism is back, monasteries have reopened, monks are training again, and religious festivals happen openly. The traditional Mongolian script is being taught in schools alongside Cyrillic, partly out of cultural pride and partly to reconnect with pre-Soviet heritage. Genghis Khan has been rehabilitated from taboo subject to national icon. His face is on the currency, his statue towers over the landscape outside Ulaanbaatar, and he's the centerpiece of Mongolia's tourism industry. There's a whole museum dedicated to him. Historical sites are being developed, and tourists come from around the world to see where the Mongol Empire started. It's national branding based on a historical figure who killed 40 million people, which is ethically complicated. But from a Mongolian perspective, it's reclaiming a source of pride that was denied for decades. The nomadic lifestyle that defined Mongolian culture for millennia is slowly fading. Now only about 25 to 30% of the population lives nomadically, down from about a third in the 1990s. Young people especially are choosing urban life over herding. If you're educated, ambitious, and connected to the internet, living in a ger on the steppe feels isolating and limiting. Cities offer jobs, entertainment, education, and opportunities that rural areas just can't match. But this creates tension. Is Mongolia still Mongolia if most Mongolians live in cities and work office jobs? What happens to the cultural identity when the lifestyle that shaped it disappears? There's no easy answer, You can't force people to remain herders for the sake of preserving tradition, but you also lose something essential when that tradition vanishes. There's also a brain drain problem. Educated young Mongolians increasingly leave for South Korea, the United States, Europe, anywhere that offers better economic opportunities. They study abroad and don't come back. They get jobs in Seoul or Sydney or San Francisco and send money home, but don't return to build careers in Mongolia. This is understandable. Wages are higher elsewhere. Opportunities are better, but it means Mongolia is losing its most talented people just when it needs them to build a more diversified economy. The population is small enough that losing even a few thousand skilled professionals every year has a noticeable impact. Infrastructure remains a major challenge. There's basically one major paved road in the entire country, running from the Chinese border through Ulaanbaatar to the Russian border. Everything else is dirt tracks that turn into mud in summer rain and freeze solid in winter. The Trans-Mongolian Railway connects to Russia and China, but it's a single line with limited capacity. Internet access is decent in Ulaanbaatar but spotty to non-existent in rural areas. Power grids are unreliable outside the capital. Building infrastructure in a country this big with this few people and this little money is a monumental task, and progress has been slow. The government talks about developing renewable energy. Mongolia has excellent solar and wind resources, but actual implementation lags behind the rhetoric. COVID hit Mongolia hard, like it did everywhere, but the economic recovery has been slow. Tourism vanished for 2 years. Mining slowed. Remittances from Mongolians working abroad dropped. The government provided some relief but was hamstrung by limited fiscal capacity. As of the mid-2020s, the economy is recovering, but inequality is worse than before, and the fundamental structural problems, resource dependence, lack of diversification, environmental degradation, urban overcrowding remain unsolved. And yet, despite all of this, Mongolia endures. The people who conquered half the known world are now navigating globalization, climate change, and the challenges of building a functional democracy in a hostile geographic and economic environment. They're not doing it perfectly. There are serious problems that may not have solutions, but they're doing it on their own terms, as an independent nation, which is more than they could say for most of the last 4 centuries. The steppe is still there. The sky is still endless. Herders still move with the seasons, even if there are fewer of them. And somewhere in the Khenti Mountains, Genghis Khan's tomb remains hidden, a reminder that empires rise and fall, but the land and the people persist. Mongolia's story isn't finished. It's still being written by herders and miners and students and activists and bureaucrats and everyone else trying to figure out what this country becomes next. The past is both a source of pride and a shadow that's hard to escape. The future is uncertain but theirs to shape. And if history has taught us anything about Mongolia, it's that underestimating the resilience of people who survive winters that drop to -50 and build empires on horseback is a mistake. They've survived worse than air pollution and commodity price volatility. They'll probably survive this too,